Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to this Group of 78 webinar on religious leader engagement, an emerging contribution to peace building. My name is Roy Culpeper. I chair the Group of 78. Cet événement se déroulera en anglais. Cependant, nous serions heureux de recevoir vos questions ou commentaires en français pendant la période de discussion. I'm making these introductory remarks in the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. In this context, I might say that today's webinar on religious leader engagement in peace building might have some relevance to ongoing efforts at reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada and indeed around the world. On behalf of the board and members of the Group of 78, it is a great honor to host our three distinguished speakers today: Brigadier General Guy Belisle, Lieutenant General the Honorable Roméo Dallaire, and Dr. Steve Moore. They will be formally introduced by Dr. Sylvie Lemieux, who is moderating today's discussion. Now, it's indeed a pleasure for me to introduce Sylvie Lemieux, as she was saying just before we went live. She's a retired Lieutenant Colonel Army engineer and formerly an executive with the Public Service of Canada. Sylvie has on two occasions represented the Green Party of Canada in 2008 and 2011. In addition to being a graduate in civil engineering, she holds a Master of Arts degree in Globalization and International Development, as well as a doctorate in conflict studies. She is presently the co-chair of the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and we are very proud to have Sylvie on the board of the Group of 78. Sylvie, over to you, and thanks for moderating.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today with former colleagues of the Canadian forces. It's a pleasure to see that we still have attendees walking in the presentation today. So we have about an hour and a half to spend with our panelists, and please allow me to introduce them in the order that they will be speaking today. It's a pleasure for me to introduce someone I consider my colleague, Dr. Steve Moore. We met many years ago at St. Paul University, and at that point in time, we were already talking about the religious leader engagement. So Steve was a padre in the Canadian Forces for about 22 years and had operational tour in Bosnia during the war of 1992-93. Was in Haiti, 97, 98, and did his doctoral research with the same thesis director as me, Dr. Vern Redcup. But in this case, he did his research in Kandahar in Afghanistan in 2006. His postdoctoral work led to the chaplain operational capability of religious leader engagement, now being integrated in military training. He has advanced RLE within NATO and the Commonwealth, increasingly assimilating a whole of government application concept that will be adapted, has been adapted to the civilian sector. He's a member of the editorial board of the Canadian Army Journal and has publication also in the military chaplain as Agents of Peace. Steve will be followed by Brigadier General Guy Belisle, who is presently the Chaplain General of the Canadian Armed Forces, and he's one of the very rare individuals in uniform that has served first as an infantry officer prior to rebadging as a Roman Catholic pastoral associate and chaplain. His knowledge and experience as a combatant officer accounts for much of his effectiveness as a padre with command and service members alike. Having served with the Royal 22e Regiment for 12 years, he deployed to Bosnia during the war in 1992, and as a padre with the troops both in Haiti, following the 2010 earthquake into Afghanistan a year later in 2011. Padre Belisle has held a series of senior positions within the Royal Canadian Chaplain Service prior to being promoted and appointed to his position as Chaplain General in June 2021. And our last panelist, someone that in my opinion, doesn't need any introduction, but please allow me to introduce Lieutenant General the Honorable Roméo Dallaire, who is the founder of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, a global partnership with the mission to end the recruitment and use of children in conflict and violence. A celebrated advocate for human rights, General Dallaire is also a respected author, government and UN advisor, and former Canadian senator, Throughout his distinguished military career, General Dallaire served most notably as force commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. He continues to work tirelessly to bring national and international attention to a situation too often ignored, whether the prevention of mass atrocities, the struggle that he and many other military veterans face with post-traumatic stress syndrome, or the recruitment and use of children as weapons of war. So I'll ask you to please welcome our panelists, and we will start with the inception of religious leader engagement, starting with Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. Appreciate that. Okay, nice to see everyone, even though I can't see you, but I know you're all there, and look forward to sharing with you today. First of all, let me thank the group of 78 for affording us the opportunity today to present and discuss with you what has emerged as a chaplain operational capability known as religious leader engagement. And also want to thank the Reverend Dr. Jim Christie for helping to facilitate this event. And also to thank my co-panelists, Chaplain General Guy Belisle and Lieutenant General the Honorable Roméo Dallaire, retired, for supporting this endeavor, and also Lieutenant Colonel retired Dr. Sylvie Lemieux for serving as our moderator. Now, can we go to the next slide? There we go. Now, I'm going to have to unpack a few terms as we go along. The military, as you know, has a language all of its own, and which can be confusing to anyone not accustomed to their jargon. First of all, let me just say that the operational environment, that's a term that you're going to be hearing, that refers to the land, sea, air, space, and cyber networks where the military operates. It includes any adversaries, allies, neutrals, systems, and subsystems. So you will hear that the operational environment. Now, the chaplain's capacity to build relationships and establish trust with local and regional religious leaders within the public space, and then the public space being where populations live, of operational environment, stands as one of the more seminal contributions to military command and their whole of government partners in decades. Undoubtedly a value added in facilitating communication and enhancing understanding where local populations, within local populations, wherever the CAF would be deployed. Now, the next slide, please. And okay, and then there are a couple animations, they're just the first one. After 3 decades of peacekeeping in Cyprus, and go to the next one, wider peacekeeping drew the international community deeper still into aiding civilian populations as Canadian Armed Forces troops found themselves in a crumbling Yugoslavia when former republics fought amongst themselves for independence. There is no peace to keep, hence the term wider peacekeeping. In 1993, I deployed with with Canadian troops to the outskirts of Sarajevo, primarily a Bosniak Muslim city, but a city under Serbian siege at the time. Our mandate was to escort contractors into the city to help rebuild a decimated infrastructure and provide military escort to convoys trucking humanitarian aid to UN-declared safe havens. And as a padre, my first worship service there was against the backdrop of mortar and small arms fire. I remember it very well. But our Bosniak Muslim interpreters informed the regional senior imam that the newly arrived Canadian contingent had 2 priests among them. We soon received an invitation for dialogue. Next slide, please. For an entire afternoon, we talked about the war and its impact on the faith communities. The president of the Visoko Imam Association, Imam Asim Astaic, the man smoking the cigarillo, a man responsible for 60 mosques, spoke passionately of his desire for reconciliation with his Serbian Orthodox brethren, who, along with the entire Serbian community, left Visoko en masse once the war erupted, and how he wanted to return to a time where they could once again share the same councils and cohabit in the same neighborhoods. We were followed by the 2nd Battalion of the Royal 22nd Regiment, the famed Vandus, and Padres Jean-Pierre Gay and Yvon Pichette, built on what we had begun, further facilitating dialogue among the religious leaders of all three faith groups, Bosniak Muslim, Serbian Orthodox, and Croat Roman Catholic, Franciscans. In a gesture of fraternity and solidarity, these same religious leaders came together in the Canadian compound for an interfaith celebration of peace, demonstrating for their respective peoples that there was a better way. They didn't have to be in conflict. They didn't have to be at war. Next slide, please. It was there that the Padres' role in the ministry of conciliation began to emerge, where the building of relationship and establishing of trust with local religious leaders could create an environment where understanding could be enhanced. Such trust can facilitate encounter, that delicate process of bringing religious leaders of opposing ethnic communities together for dialogue. It is in such exchanges that change can take root, something that can be described as double vision. This is where one does not simply see the other from one's own perspective, but begins to view oneself from the perspective of the other, seeding reconciliation. Next slide, please. An evolving operational environment. You can see that term, operational environment. In 2006, while completing my doctoral studies with Dr. Vern Neufeld-Redekop, I deployed to Kandahar, Afghanistan, to conduct research. There, I shadowed our Muslim chaplain, Imam Suleiman Dallaire, who had begun collaborating with the commander's political advisor in engaging the religious Islamic leadership of Kandahar province. The animation, please. This was a first for a chaplain to collaborate with our whole of government partners, or some might say whole of community. Excuse me. And to give you some idea, when I say whole of government, active in that theater of operations at the time, you would have had Foreign Affairs Canada, the Canadian International Development Agency in those days, Justice, RCMP, Public Safety, Correctional Services Canada, and of course, the Canadian Armed Forces for Security. Deemed as a secularist and therefore a threat to their way of life, Gavin Buchan, a seasoned diplomat with Foreign Affairs Canada, was viewed with suspicion as such had not been able to communicate with the religious leaders, an absolute must in an Islamic nation. Imam Dallaire, on the other hand, moved with ease within their circles. Next slide, please. An invitation went out to the Ulama Council, and that's who you see there. A governor's religious advisory group of 12 mullah for a shura to be held at the provincial reconstruction team in Kandahar with Imam Dallaire as chair. And over a period of months, Dallaire attended a number of shuras and learned that the Ulama Council of Sunni mullah had earlier representation from the Shia Islamic faith community, the Shia being roughly 15% of the population of Kandahar province. 2 years prior, the Shia mullah had been assassinated by the Taliban and never replaced on the council by the governor. Cognizant of the ongoing sectarian violence in Iraq at that time, Buchan recognized that the continued isolation of the Shia leadership in Kandahar province was a dangerous precedent precipitating a situation vulnerable to violent exploitation. Next slide, please. And after many conversations, and having attended a number of Sunni and Shia shuras, Imam Demaray learned that these estranged faith communities shared many of the same aspirations, which were basically they wanted to leave a legacy for their respective youth other than sectarian violence and war, and they wanted help in establishing madrasas where more moderate Islamic curriculum could be taught. Because what was happening here, many of the Sunni youth were being siphoned off by the Taliban to attend madrasas in the Western territories of Pakistan, and they were hoping to see that change. Known as superordinate goals, it is often that opposing groups may be brought together to achieve a common purpose, something to which both aspire, but simply cannot accomplish alone. Next slide, please. In 2007, Shia mullahs attended the Ulama Council for the first time in several years to appeal together with their Sunni counterparts to the governor for assistance in attaining their goals. Imam Demaray returned several times over the course of the following year in an effort to sustain the thawing of relations between the Sunni and Shia leadership that had begun. Alas, what had evolved on an ad hoc basis without structural or institutional support could not be sustained. However, the experiences of chaplains in both Bosnian and Afghan operational environments had not gone unnoticed, warranting serious reflection as to what might be accomplished in the future if command were to create the necessary strategic space and organizational support for such a capability. And following the completion of my doctorate, I was posted to the concept cell of what is now the Canadian Army Land Warfare Center, led by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Rostek at the time. And for months, I immersed myself in Army publications, endeavoring to discern ways to integrate my concepts into existing doctrine. Next slide, please. It was here that I was introduced to the comprehensive approach, known in Army parlance as JIMP. Okay, so this gets a little dicey, but bear with me and I'll explain it. Next, the animation, please. There we go. So you can see the joint is here. It represents the combined nature of operations. Okay, that's Army, Navy, and Air Force, something that the military has done for decades. Then you see the interagency, the reinforcing synergies, government departments and agencies collaborating together, including international organization and NGOs, so that you might consider that your whole of government piece. And the multinational numbers of nations collaborating together under the auspices of the UN, NATO, or coalition. So you see the joint, the interagency, and the multinational, but you'll notice that the public sphere is the largest of all four. And the public space is host to local populations and organizations indigenous to the region, and undoubtedly the most consequential. Without a modicum of support from local populations, it is difficult to conduct successful operations. So with the help of my colleagues, a religious area analysis began to emerge, where through the lens of the chaplain, who's trained in theological understanding, the chain of command is briefed as to the religious terrain of an area of operations. An area of operations being like a geographical area for which the contingent would be responsible. Now, the religious terrain would include such things as in the public space, who are the faith groups? Who are the religious leaders? What complexion does a given faith expression exhibit in that particular part of the world? What were the holy days? What are the festivals? Are there large movements of peoples like pilgrimage? Where are the sacred sites, the shrines? What are the local customs? And what activities and behaviors should be avoided by troops? And what ways would we be able to be supportive? And many other. And so the chaplain is able to advise command on all of these issues. And of course, religious leader engagement took shape whereas security permits and under commander's directions, chaplains engage local and religious leaders and become a conduit for communication, be that from command or from local religious leaders to command. So chaplains are able to contribute much due to their ability to move freely within religious circles. And this, the next slide, please. The diagram, this is John Paul Lederach, a Mennonite peace builder in the States. And this illustrates how that religious leaders serve as what is called middle range actors. You see that there on the side, who enjoy the confidence of the grassroots, people at the grassroots, while moving freer at the higher levels of leadership within their own communities. And their ease of movement affords them relationships at the highest levels as well as at the grassroots, hence a high degree of social capital within communities. And those of moderate voice exist and often are willing to reach across ethnic divides to their religious counterparts of kindred spirit in search of ways to transcend violence, where together they may begin the healing of memory and look to write new narratives or new ways of being in relation. So this is not to suggest that chaplains are experts in conflict resolution. It is imperative that they stay in their own lane. But what chaplains bring is a capacity to facilitate dialogue and to enhance communication among community leaders in situations where it has been dangerously lacking. And under certain circumstances, possibly bring others to the table who have greater expertise in such matters. So what you're about to hear now from Chaplain General Belisle pertains to how this chaplain operational capability continues in its adaptation to the Canadian Armed Forces. The next slide, please. The Canadian Armed Forces as an organization, and in both operational and training environments. And he will speak not only of overseas deployments, something that is called expeditionary operations, but also talk about the engagement here at home, domestic operations in Canada, as well as the CAF response to natural disasters away from our shores, humanitarian operations, which in many instances falls to the Navy. And lastly, General Dallaire will take us further yet as he considers broader applications. So thank you very much, and I return the floor to you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. I would like to pass the baton immediately to Brigadier General Guy Belisle. Please proceed. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone from Winnipeg. So I want to take this opportunity to express how grateful I am to be able to speak to you about religious leader engagement and religious area analysis. I need to start by thanking retired Chaplain Steve Moore for his work, both while in the Canadian Armed Forces and outside of it, in developing this capability and socializing it. Steve has been a tireless advocate for the soft power that Arley offers to our military leaders, and perhaps more importantly, the benefit that it affords the host nations where our military members operate. Thank you, Steve, for all you have done, are doing, and will do in the future. Thank you very much. Next slide. So the first thing I would like to share with you is the growth of Arley and RA over the last few years and some of our success stories. I'm sure those of you who live in Canada remember the tragedy at the mosque shooting in Quebec in 2017. For those of you not familiar, 27 years old Alexander Bissonnette entered in the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City shortly after 8 p.m. on the evening of January 29. He opened fire on those gathered for prayer, killing 6 people and wounding 5 others. The horrific event was alleged to be the result of Islamophobia. In its wake, the community was badly shaken, distrustful, and grieving. What is not as well known was the hourly that was planned by the chaplain team and 2Div under the leadership of Captain Navy Bonnie Mason, now my chief of staff. She, along with the wonderful chaplain team based in Valcartier, just outside of Quebec City, reached out to the grieving community and not only express their condolence, but plan an interfaith service in Quebec so that the Islamic community could feel supported and know that they were not alone in their grief. Prayer services were organized across the entire Canadian Armed Forces in a show of solidarity. In 2019, a massive hurricane devastated the Bahamas. The Canadian Navy was soon mobilized to send ships to support relief efforts. The senior fleet chaplain on board, Lieutenant Commander Rob Parker, conducted a RA and share with the ship captain so that they would have an understanding of where people would gather and who could be contacted on the ground if formal government channels were closed and building destroyed. I don't want to make it seem that this capability are useful during disaster and tragedies. One of our Navy chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel Keen Newhook, prepared a RA on the port where their ship was landing and delivered it to the ship chain of command. Through that, the chain of command learned that the local area was not accepting of same-sex couples, that any displays of physical affection between members of the same sex could lead to violence and put a couple in danger. One of the ship's crew was in the same-sex relationship and had planned to meet their partner in the area for a few day R&R. After the chaplain shared this information with the ship leadership, the member was informed and a potential incident was avoided. Next slide. Obviously, these successes, but a few of 1,000, came about because of changes that this capability almost forced upon us in the RCCHS. We had to develop a training plan and teach how to conduct RLE and RA. This has been implemented into all our core chaplain courses. We started collaborating and training with the U.S. chaplaincy in an annual exercise called the Canis CIMEX. Having this capability also afforded us the opportunity to practice it in the formal exercises. I cannot stress to you how much of a change this was for the RCCHS. Chaplains have always supported exercises in real time, taking care of members who were on them and advising chain of commands, but we had never conducted training with chaplain on these large joint exercises. All of a sudden, we were training on the biggest army exercise of the year alongside our peers from other occupations. Clearly, a shift in the way we train. Doing this afforded our chaplain the opportunity to work with the chain of commands we were part of, have them understanding what RLE and RA were, and probably most importantly, these non-chaplain leaders were exposed to the benefits that RLE could give them as COs on the ground. Because of chaplain's presence, realistic religious information was written into the landscape of these exercises so that all members of the training audience were exposed to a more realistic and challenging scenario. Next slide. Of course, with success, there are also challenges. The success of RLE during deployments mean that the business of our chaplain has increased. Chaplains sometimes have had difficulty balancing their time between humanitarian and relationship between efforts with that of their main job, which is ensuring emotional and spiritual support to our troops. Religious leader engagement as a capability rightfully belongs in information operation, a section that also houses intelligence CIMIC, and psychological operations. The expectation is that everyone in this section works together and share information for the betterment of the mission. This has raised ethical consideration for our chaplain, wondering about whether it is right to share information we gather through our trusted relationship with others in our force who may use the information for targeting our manipulation purpose. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing the RCC is how to socialize this capability both within and outside of the chaplaincy. It is an occupational hazard that we don't do a great job tooting our own horn as we see caring for people. In this case, from those in host nation, as a logical extension of our ministry of care. Because of this, why RLE and RA are understood and supported at the strategic level, they are not well understood by CEOs on the ground who have never trained with chaplains. Chaplains have missed opportunity to conduct RLEs and though be force multipliers for their CEOs for no other reason than the CEOs didn't want to potentially put their chaplain in harm's way because of going to church. COVID-19 has not helped our development of this capability. Army exercises have been downsized for the safety of personnel, and all of those relationship capability that require actors, dialogue and meeting in close proximity have been eliminated. We thus have been training our chaplain in exercises or traveling to work with our US partner. Next slide. So how are we going to address the challenges that I mentioned and further support RA and RLE into the CAF of the future? I have just overseen the development of a new strategic plan for our chaplaincy. The final touches are being put on the RCCHS Spiritual Resiliency and Wellbeing Strategy 2020-2030. RLE and RA are one of my key lines of effort, and I have appointed RLE RA OPI to outline how we are going to develop this capability. We have set aside funds to hire a contractor who will write joint RLE and RA doctrine. This doctrine is for the RCCHS and will provide the foundation from which to socialize the capability in the Navy and Air Force environment. It will be updated so that it meets my intent and the needs of the Canadian Armed Forces in a post-Afghanistan context. We will be exploring additional tools that we can give to our chaplains that will facilitate their ability to provide RAs to the chain of command and to conduct religious leaders engagement. Tools such as a third-party neutral training for conflict mediation, pluralism, and training on the Child Soldier Initiative. In addition to maintaining our religious leader engagement work in expeditionary theater of operation, I will be asking our chaplain leader to shift the focus to domestic theaters of operation, maybe even making it as a primary reserve lead. Religious leader engagement with spiritual and faith tradition leader in Canada holds incredible value, as the mass shooting in Quebec poignantly demonstrated. Not only would domestic RLE increase the RCCHS ability to liaise with diverse spiritual faith tradition leaders, hopefully leading to a boom in a recruiting from those who do not traditionally apply to be chaplain in the Canadian Armed Forces, but it will help the military build bridges with sometimes disenfranchised peoples, such as those individuals living in indigenous communities. While I could likely go on for another half an hour about all those possibilities, the last one I want to share with you today is our plan to collaborate with chaplain partners in other nations and to partner with organizations whose goal and intent foster cooperation with ours in the RCCHS and where RLE can flourish. I'm thinking especially about our collaboration with the Dallaire Center of Excellency within the CAF and the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, which is external to DND. The RCCHS collaboration with General Dallaire and these organizations that bear his name is a natural fit for us in the chaplaincy, as helping our soldier deal with the turmoil of facing child soldier and the potential moral injury that can develop as a result is what we do. Further, our religious leader engagement capability is one of the ways that the issue of child soldier can be discussed, and Indigenous religious and community leaders' influence to eliminate the practice within their respective nation. General Dallaire, it's a pleasure seeing you here, and I look forward to many future collaboration opportunities. The floor is yours.
Just before I give you the floor, merci beaucoup, Général Belisle. Merci pour votre présentation. I just would like to point to all our attendees that at the bottom of your screen, you have something called Q&As. So one member's already asked one question. Don't be shy to write your question. They will be, we'll hopefully address them all. But as you're hearing, maybe some expression or some thoughts that you'd like to share, please start filling in your Q&A. Alors, mon général Dallaire, c'est à votre tour. Si vous pouvez.
Merci beaucoup. Et puis, merci à mes collègues, merci Padre Guy et Steven, bravo pour avoir donné ce tour d'horizon de l'évolution, justement, d'une dimension qui était quasi non existante dans le passé, mais qui a pris une position d'envergure dans le futur. Et merci aussi de nous permettre de travailler ensemble pour éliminer des terrains de conflit, un instrument horrible et ignoble qui est l'utilisation des enfants comme arme de guerre. Advanced thinking, the progressive thinking of the chaplain branch in regards to looking at conflicts and looking at the dimension of what the chaplaincy can be involved in has advanced significantly. Thanks a lot to Steve, of course, and the realization by commanders that this is a significant capability that has an operational aspect to it that cannot be ignored. The work, as an example, that we're doing in training the padres and assisting them with the doctrine for the elimination, ultimately, of the use of children as weapons of war is most progressive, and in fact, is leading the Canadian Forces in its transition to recognizing the horrific impact of children being used as such weapons that ultimately sustain these wars, and they become ultimately generational wars. So well done to the chaplaincy in this regard. My work right now in the application of the international dimensions of conflict comes in the form of being part of a commission based out of Geneva that is looking at the principles of the principles of peace. I get so wrapped up in war. And what we're looking at is the principles of peace, but lasting peace. Now, that's a qualifier that has not been in existence for some time. Because what we've seen is war and then a peace period and then conflicts restart, and then we sort of go back and turn in the same cycle so many times. In fact, the data has proven that over the last 25 years, certainly since the end of the Cold War, with all these imploding nations and failing states, civil wars, mass atrocities, and even genocide, that 70%, and that figure is approximate, of course, 70% of all the peace agreements that have been signed by the elites in the conflict zones and the elites of the international community and the organizations, that 70% of them don't last more than 7 years. That these countries fall right back into a conflict that sometimes is even exacerbated by the frictions that have been created by the interventions of the international community. So the aim is to go for lasting peace. And what is the essence of lasting peace is, in fact, what we are trying to pull from the different elements that can be engaged in the peace processes. We're talking with the political side. We're talking with the security forces, of course. We're involved with the youth in those countries, because in some nations, too many nations, in fact, the demographics are representing or showing that over 50% of the population is under 15. So if they're under 15 and all they know is war and conflict, what are they bringing to their adulthood? And how do you move out of that cycle? We're seeing an extraordinary requirement for the women dimension. Women are the essence of the human dimension in regards to looking for peace and serenity and security for families. And so the women's side, both in the leadership role and also as a social influence within the communities, we're looking at their engagement in a far more progressive one. We're looking at the NGO community and the old methodologies of the NGO community in different agencies that work internationally, and whether or not the separation of the military civilian side is actually something that can pursue in that very, very, very difficult friction that exists often between the two. We have seen collaboration, we have seen cooperation, we've seen coordination between the security side and the humanitarian side, even with the diplomats. But we have not seen an integration. We've not seen the ability to bring all these different disciplines together in a synergy of looking at how the future can be met with a more progressive, proactive anticipation of conflict, which goes beyond reconciliation. It goes to the heart of what a society is. We have also been looking quite interestingly at the whole religious dimension of societies and of communities and their influence within that and within the whole social structure of a nation. And so these different groupings, we have over 120 organizations that have been meeting with several thousand individuals to seek what can be some of those solutions. And it is interesting to note that we're looking not only at state actors and at the elites and how they are formulating and coming to agreements around the table in peace agreements, but we have discovered, and it's been brought so much to our attention over the last decades, is that a peace agreement that is not responding to the needs of the individual, the local community, their ability to find that serenity and the hope that they need in seeing that the peace agreement is bringing to them. If they can't see it, if they can't participate in it, then what we're seeing is an undermining ultimately of those peace processes. And so sometimes some of those peace agreements and the very, very dynamic stabilization, militarization of so many of those operations have, in fact, exacerbated the solutions. And without that local involvement, we are simply trying to meet very short-term and often very skewed solutions, to which many of these peace agreements don't even come to fruition. Meaning that there are elements that are agreed to, there are funds that are provided, there's a security dimension that is dominating, and ultimately there is so much of the actual human security dimension for the individuals to have the confidence that the peace agreement is actually going to last and that they can actually build on that whole governance restructuring. All those elements are so waning in the solutions that we're finding today. And so what of this particular aspect, that is to say, the religious dimension of peace? Well, apart from our individual seeking of peace and serenity and in our own spiritual framework in which we want to live in, what in fact can this dimension bring to the evolving, long-lasting solutions to conflicts that means lasting peace? And that's where we're at. We've been at it for nearly a year now, and we're looking at, in our discussions with religious leaders, and we've been through right now Africa, we're looking at Latin America, we'll be going to, of course, Asia, but certainly the Middle East is one very significant arena. For, in my personal opinion, if we don't find peace in the Middle East, I don't think humanity will ever find lasting peace. And so the religious dimension of so many of these conflicts, where the people are communicating with their trusted local leadership, where the religious leaders have, in fact, significant impact on their way of life and how they actually can meet the challenges of their society and find the reconciliation, find, in fact, a seeking of going beyond the frictions of some of their differences and absolutely accepting the fundamental premise that all humans are human, that not one of us is more human than the others. And so the religious leaders are certainly the great movers of the grassroots of all peace. And we believe that it's in seeking a solution through this dimension will assist us in building the other sides of the disciplines that are needed to be brought online to establish solutions of lasting peace, ultimately to actually come to grips with the creation of principles of peace. Principles of peace. This is looking at what are the references that can guide those who are engaged in assisting in bringing peace, and even more so in preventing conflicts from starting. What are the principles that can guide them in ensuring that what is negotiated and how it's negotiated and how it's brought about is meeting the demands of the population, and that the population believe in it and are building with it, versus meeting the demands of the donors, which is often in friction with the ultimate aim, meeting the demands of the security side, which has a dominant role, of course, in so many of these conflicts, and meeting the demands of the international humanitarian side of the house, which are, of course, very human rights based and are attempting to find that equilibrium themselves. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we need to look at how the religious dimension, the spiritual dimension reflected through the religious leaders from the grassroots all the way through to the structural of a nation and how its governance is evolving, that how are we able to extract from that elements that can, in fact, influence specifically the instruments of peace, that the instruments of conflict resolution, of the instruments of mandates to forces and to personnel who are deployed, so that they can, in fact, use that to bring the local community, the individuals, into the main premise of peace. The individuals are the sovereign entity. The state is no more an absolute sovereign, since the responsibility to protect doctrine. It is the individual that is sovereign. And so in the individual, that spiritual dimension and a religious dimension has a significant play. And that's what we are seeking to bring to the table as a dominant player. I've been involved in a number of peace agreements, and one of the more interesting, skewed ones to just not go on too long because of the time limit that was given to us, was when I was sent into Darfur by Prime Minister Martin to look at how Canada can assist in bringing a certain peace process to fruition between the African-based Sudanese, which were essentially Darfurians, and the Arab-based Sudanese, which were from the rest of the Sudan. And it was interesting that on the ground we had received this comprehensive peace agreement, only to realize that there was no involvement whatsoever in bringing that comprehensive peace agreement by the women who were being slaughtered and raped and so on, let alone their inputs into what the solutions can be for their families and for their local communities. The youth who were being used as the instruments of war, the militias, they were made up of the youth. None of that structure was at all involved whatsoever. And nothing on the religious side of the house was even raised. There was no attempt to open up a dialogue through that extraordinary and I think very unique frame of structure that we have. That is to say that the religious leaderships and the people who intervene with them in establishing the atmosphere of peace, that they could, in fact, be a significant element of lasting peace. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I've gone on too long, but only to say that this operationalization, if I can use the term, of the whole religious dimension of these stabilization scenarios and missions that are out there is a significant factor in bringing lasting peace right down to the roots of the nation, to their frictions, and ultimately remind them fundamentally that they are all equal and that it's not the elites that in fact make lasting peace. It is the engagement of the people in their society and how they can live with the frictions between them and how they can find that comfort of their soul, their being, and their persons, and find the hope for their next generations. And so, thank you for giving me the opportunity of expressing this dimension that is taking on more and more of a weight. Thank you for giving me a chance of saying how progressive the Canadian chaplaincy is in looking at particularly an angle that could, in fact, bring people to the peace table much more easily, like the whole story or the whole dimension of child soldiers and how they can participate in reducing the threats out there. And if you can get people sitting around a table, the leadership at all levels, to say, we're going to stop recruiting under 13, you'll be able to talk to them about other things too. And that's why we believe that children up front can lead to peace, and that children who are guided will ultimately live in peace. And so well done to the Chaplaincy of Canada. And well done, Steve, for getting yourself involved in the process of doctrine and so on, which is you need the patience of Job, at least, to be able to survive that. So well done to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Merci beaucoup, mon général. Merci à tous nos panélistes. I note that we have about 25 minutes for questions, and we have about 9 questions right now. As a moderator, just trying to look here and you know, how we can summarize. I think in a way I'm picking up a little bit on all of the presenters, our panelists here, and in thinking that, you know, the focus we're talking about here is basically encouraging all of our attendees to open up to the perspective of the others. which were the words that Steve used. Open up to the perspective of others to engage here nationally and internationally. And what I found fascinating with this process is that from an idea, it becomes a training. How we train and educate, in this case, our chaplains, and expanding their own religious worldviews to be able to sincerely and meaningfully sit down and come to a table, which basically is a table to build peace. And so I think in a way, what we're talking about is creating those connectors that are able to hold two worldviews or three or four and able to radiate like peace, in a very meaningful way through a process. So I'm very, very encouraged. And as a grandmother, I'm very encouraged. This concept is very hopeful. And I've noted here in some of our attendees that I have colleagues that comes from the RCMPs that are trying to do their own local engagement. And we have former colleagues like General Maurice Barry, who's attending today, and others here that hopefully, can all say how much they appreciated our panelists. So 10 questions, a very short period of time. I'm going to go with the first one because I think it speaks of these special skill sets we're talking about here. So this question is from Lawrence Cumming. Considering the long and difficult history of Christian-Muslim relationship, could the speakers address the apparent ease with which Christian clergy were able to establish constructive relationships with local Muslim leaders in both case studies mentioned by Dr. Moore, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Afghanistan? What is more than good luck and interpersonal chemistry? Was it more than good luck and interpersonal chemistry that were not seen as crusader or perhaps as agents of a temporary occupying force, but rather as a helpful interlocutors and even mediators? So I don't know who wants to address this first.
Well, thank you, Lawrence. Do you mind if I address that? Thank you, Lawrence. I know Lawrence, and I'm not surprised that a great question would come from him. He was executive director for Oxfam here in Canada for 10 years and a member of my congregation. Now, you've raised a question here. What is more? It was more than good luck and interpersonal chemistry. That's something, Lawrence, that we have, experienced in the operational environment. As padres and Christian padres, as we were in Bosnia, we were, especially with the Bosniaks, we were considered, people of the book. And we have found, and many chaplains have had this experience, that in conflict situations, that the spiritual leaders on the ground actually sought out chaplains to engage in dialogue. And it was regardless of our faith tradition. They recognized that there was definite common ground between us because we were people of faith as they saw it, and as we see them as people of faith. And as a result of that, we were deemed, faith community leaders, and they wanted to engage us on a spiritual plane. I mean, these conversations were more than just conversations. I mean, we actually looked at our own faith traditions and where there were commonalities and where we might be able to come together. And when I was in Haiti, we were there with the Pakistanis and 33 Punjab Battalion. And the commandant of that, we were in his office, and he said, Padre, I'm Muslim and you're Christian, and we could talk about the differences that exist between us. the doctrine of the Trinity or the deity of Christ and things of this nature. He said, but that would be a shame for us to look at things that divide us rather than things that unite us, because the Haitian people can benefit from our unity. And I have found that often to be the case. Now, obviously, some of this has been personality driven over the years, but what we are endeavoring to see now is how to move that away from the ad hoc experiences to it becoming more institutionalized, where chaplains receive, the kind of training that Brigadier General Belisle was talking about. So this is, and so that would, in that sense, we will look to become more helpful interlocutors. And, we're not, chaplains do not have expertise in conflict resolution, but it would not be, I believe it would be advantageous if they did have third-party neutral training to a degree where they can mediate to a degree. But that's not something for me to decide. But thank you for that question.
Would General Belisle or General Dallaire would like to address the same question about the special skill sets that might be required to be a good religious leader? I'm not seeing Général Belisle. Je vois.
Oui, j'ai just I just came back. Everything was frozen, so I was trying. So I lost a bit of the conversation. Sorry.
Okay. I was just asking about the first question there, which basically was, my own word here, was just a series of luck that you had there. You just had to have the right padre with the right skill sets, or, are you aiming at having all the padres right now having those special skill sets to be able to get into the perspective of the others and becoming agents of helpful interlocutor and not being seen as crusaders as maybe they were in the past?
No, I think it's very important. The training is very, very important, and Steve can talk about it also. But we already having training at the chaplain school and board in regards to the training, ensuring that all the chaplains have the training to be able to support their CEO and be able to work with the concept or RLE, which is so important because if you remember within my few example, it can be done with the Air Force, it can be done with the Army, and even on the ship. So all chaplain, 100% of our chaplain will be trained at the school, make sure that they are able to support the chain of command in their role. So there's no doubt that, but for sure, the training is also important. And this is why we're going with, we have a training. I think it's every year we're going to United States. We're working with the American. They got a great technology about training their chaplain with regards to this, and so we're working closely with them to make sure that our chaplain are well trained and this capacity.
Moi, je vais juste dire un mot, si vous permettez. In this era that we've stumbled into, we are facing complex and ambiguous scenarios using mandates that are often ill-defined, using words and mandates that are not defined, and objectives that are not necessarily shared by all the both donor countries or engaged countries, let alone the different disciplines that are on the ground. And so where can you find an ability to introduce a new capability on the ground that can, in fact, go beyond what we have in the past been doing? Because what we used in the past is not working today, is not working in this era. And so how do you leap ahead and bring new capabilities for the ultimate aim of establishing an atmosphere of security that ultimately will lead to a lasting peace, which we hope. And that is looking at areas like, as an example, with women in the forces and more able to be present in the front lines, their ability to communicate with women in the local areas has opened up incredible new opportunities. The work we've done in Somalia, in talking with the wives of some of the al-Shabaab leaders, has helped us stop the recruitment of children, because the women have agreed that this makes no sense. And so it was military women who were able to talk. Men couldn't even get close to the place. But this whole operationalized capability, this new capability that commanders will be able to see, but most importantly, the whole mission will be able to learn from the religious comprehension and application of the knowledge and the background and the experience and the links, trusted links, not only between the population and even potentially the belligerents, both state and non-state, but the links that they establish with those leadership that are having the trusted beliefs of the population. Not the elites, but that new angle is of enormous capability enhancement, and I would call a force multiplier. And so, yeah, the padres have got to have that training, that sensitivity, that ability to establish those links of communication, but also the commanders and the other elements, the other disciplines in the field have got to comprehend that this religious engagement is a new potential for solving and bringing communication between the different elements, and ultimately assisting in stabilizing peace, but also assist enormously on reducing casualties on both sides to be able to find a peaceful solution without having to always go kinetic.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you very much. So maybe there were some inborn capacity by some of our earliest chaplain, but I'm getting a sense here that there's been a lot of discussion inside the military and for operational support, so that right now the training is aimed as being able to be able to reach out to the others with the perspective of the others, with the idea of, like you said, Mon Général, a meaningful and participative negotiation, so that they rest on solid foundation. Now, as an engineer, I like the foundation and also the structure, so that mandates are not empty words, and that together people can build the resource and the skill sets for lasting peace. I have numerous questions here. I'd like to tell my panelists to start looking at some of these questions, because some of them are very, very specific to all of you. There's quite a lot of good congratulation notes here, and thanking you for the support. But I am just going to say here, I've picked up, and I have someone helping me choosing the right questions, maybe sadly our last questions, but I have one here, and maybe it's one that may resonate with us, in this complex world we're living in right now. So it's from Matt. It was addressed to you, Steve, but I think all panelists could answer this one. The RLE conceptual framework seem to emphasize, prioritize engaging, tolerant, moderate voices. In light of the current dynamics of asymmetric warfare that often involve or are led by extreme voices, what are your thoughts regarding the need to maybe potentially include extreme voices within the scope of RLE? What challenges do you envisage? maybe less friendly territories?
That's a very, very good question, and one that I have wrestled with. It's probably, I'm moving into territory that isn't mine, and because the chaplain general, of course, he controls the kind of training that needs to take place. Extreme voices. There is a certain pathology with extremists that makes it very difficult in order to engage. That doesn't mean it's impossible. I'm not sure that's the purview of a chaplain to be engaging the extremists. If perchance there was a situation where an extremist wanted to engage in dialogue about peaceful resolutions, then perhaps if they chose to speak to a chaplain, the chaplain could bring others to the table that have the kind of expertise to deal in those kinds of situations. But the chaplains need to have more training to prepare them for these kinds of situations. And we're not, we were in Cyprus for nearly 30 years, and then in Bosnia for more than a decade, and in Afghanistan more than a decade, in conflict situations. It's now been 7-8 years since we've had those kinds of large deployments in conflict situations. I'm not sure. I don't know how often we will find ourselves in that kind of an operational environment in the future. It seems that for the Canadian Armed Forces, that they're moving more toward smaller missions and perhaps more of them. But anyway, it is. It's a very. I'm not really answering that question very satisfactorily because I don't have any experience dealing with extremists, and those of moderate voice. We seek those because they are the ones who want to transcend the violence and often have the voice, have a voice with the people, and are respected and revered. And so consequently, I think they have tremendous opportunity to advance peace. I'd leave that with my colleagues if they want to speak to that.
I don't know if we have a taker here.
Vas-y, Guy, à moins que tu gères.
I think is he frozen?
Allez-y, j'avais encore perdu le Internet, fait que j'ai pas entendu encore la dernière question, désolé.
Okay. Ben, je vais y aller à ce cas-là et puis on regardera. We are still at the start of a new era. Even though it's been 30 years since the end of the Cold War, this era is not about to end. And the complexity and ambiguity of these missions are going to continue to make it very difficult to apply some of the old tools that we've had, from classic use of force to the new dimensionals, to the integration, hopefully, that I believe in, of the different disciplines that are being deployed. And so we are still too often ad hocing things. We're still on-job training, certainly. We are still learning lessons that we hope are being applied, as we've seen it should be with Afghanistan and the like. But it is my belief that there is a sense of urgency that's required by the different components of the forces, let alone the NGO world, let alone the diplomats, let alone the nation builders and so on, to realize that with the big players, the Chinas, the USA, the Russians, they're going to continue to posture themselves and trying to figure out exactly where they want to situate the power structures of the world. While they're doing that, and I expect that to take 10, 20 years before we see any real massive capability coming out that's got any direction and traction in the world, that we're going to be facing a whole bunch of these imploding nations and failing states. I give you the example just of Africa right now. We have never seen so many countries that are imploding right now. And the ones that we've been at, the Congos and the Somalia, South Sudan, where I've got people. Look at Mozambique that's fallen back into it. Look at Cameroon's problems, and I can continue with the listing. Let alone some of the frictions that will come from the climate scenario and from the frictions that exist in the richnesses of resource-based countries and non-resource-based countries. All that to say that there is a sense of urgency that is essential to learn new skills, acquire new knowledge, and reshape what we see from the security side of the house, as well as from the humanitarian side, as well as from the diplomatic political side, to look at peace from a whole different angle. That is to say, to start with the premise of attempting to prevent conflicts from starting, let alone falling into them after the frictions have exploded and ultimately have created so much friction. And so people who can get into the front lines and on the groundwork are people who are involved, in my opinion, with the population, with women, with children, with the spirituality of the nation and the individuals therein, and how you get the human being becoming the center of focus and not the national entities that we always seem to build on first, only to find out that below that, it's nothing. There's nothing behind it. It's just the elites, and that surface can disintegrate as we saw in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The questions are keep coming in, but sadly, this will be my last one, and it will be a very simple one. I will summarize Ellen Bennett's question, which is basically, deploying male and female chaplain on an equal basis. Would this work? And since I do not know sincerely, how many female chaplain we have right now, I don't know exactly who can address this question. And I just need to know to all our attendees that General Belisle is really having a hard time with the connection in Winnipeg. And sadly, he's been in and out, the last number of minutes. So I don't know if you, Steve can address this question or.
And the question is,
women, male and female chaplain on an equal basis, as religious leader, and maybe some context. Could this work?
Well, I mean, that's a fair question, and I really don't know how many female chaplains we have. Chaplain General could respond to that. I do know that that is contextual, because in my estimation, if you're looking at this through the lens of religious leader engagement, one must consider, the culture, the context where that kind of activity is taking place. Not all cultures are as open to, female involvement as others. However, that there have been female chaplains that have been very successful, even in Islamic cultures, and have received quite warmly by religious leaders. and seen as the spiritual leaders for who they are, and they've been very, very effective. So that's, in my estimation, that is contextually driven. I do like what General Dallaire is talking about when he talks about how that female soldiers have been able to engage females in an area of operations with great success when men could not. And speaking to mothers as heads of households and having that kind of impact. I think, frankly, females can be tremendous peace builders. So whether or not, they are deployed on an equal basis is not my that's for the chaplain general and his staff to decide that. But
so I just got an answer from through the chat line that right now 20% of our Canadian chaplains are female in the forces. And just to address your point there, Steve, I was an Army engineer, and I serve on a humanitarian mission, and I was sent on that mission by the UN because I was a woman. And my work at the time was to teach women and children how to recognize anti-personal mines while they were in Pakistani refugee camps, and they were getting ready to deploy in Afghanistan. And Canada provided full rotation of female engineers to be able to be those teachers, so that we could easily go into clinics, into parks and various places. And it was very interesting for me to be always surrounded by women and children. And very often we would teach in male camps, and we would be received by the mullah first and be introduced. So it was just different opportunities, a different reason, different goals. But it was certainly my very memorable experience of being able to serve, in that function while in uniform. So there is no doubt in my military mind that the male-dominated, egocentric, misogynist world that so much has created apparent civilization or not is not going to work anymore. And that unless we see women and men as capabilities for what they can individually bring, and that they can together synergize into a new philosophy of leadership, new philosophy of employment, new philosophy of actual engagement in solutions in the field, or in any endeavor, unless that's seen as an integrating of the two genders into this and acknowledgement of other gender dimensions, we will fail in moving humanity forward. And so, there's got to be this new capabilities. It's not the right term. We cannot continue to be a male-dominated humanity. It just isn't going to sustain the problems and solve them. It's going to, on the contrary, keep us in friction and ultimately not get new dimensions of solutions that are critical, because we male just don't grasp all the answers in all the dimensions. So go for it. Absolutely go for it. And of course, the Catholic Church might have a problem with that. Right. Well, that's why we got Guy there, and we wish him all the best.
Perfect.
I must apologize to all of our attendees who have been asking us questions here. Thank you very much for your participation. It's now time for me, as your moderator, to give the baton to the president of the group of 78, Roy, for the concluding remark.
Thank you, Sylvie. Clearly, we could have gone on for another half hour. There's a lot of good questions and comments, and a lot of commendation from our participants for the work that is being done under the umbrella of RLE and RAA. So I take that as an affirmation of the work that you're doing and encouragement to do more. So I'd like to thank our three distinguished speakers, not only for enhancing our awareness of the crucially important role of religious leaders in peace building, but also for your individual efforts toward building a world of sustainable peace and common security. I want to take this opportunity to also convey enormous thanks to the Reverend Dr. Jim Christie, a member of our G78 board, who helped to bring about this webinar today. Jim might well have joined the panel were it not for some health issues that have required that he slow down the frenetic pace of his activities. So Godspeed and recovery to you, Jim. Finally, as always, thanks to Sarah Bowles, our Group of 78 Executive Secretary, who makes our webinars come together so well. And thank you to all of our audience participants for your very thoughtful questions and reflections. I hope we can convey these to our speakers for their own edification and further reflection after the webinar. So thank you very much, and let's find a way of keeping this conversation going.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.